John Adams proclaimed the old State House the place where the child independence was born. And so too, in that site was born, I think, the vision of an American Union called to life by the Massachusetts House of Representatives' 1768 circular letter, which appealed to the other colonial assemblies to join together in protecting their liberties. And here, where you are sitting tonight, on the night of December 16th, 1773, 5,000 people gathered here. So I want you to look around and imagine how you could possibly fit 5,000 people in this space. But they gathered here in the very seat of popular protest in revolutionary Boston to hear Samuel Adams declare, "There is nothing further this meeting can do to save the country." And off they went to change the world. Tonight, we consider the complex legacy of those famous beginnings in the story of our nation. The revolution may have empowered white men of modest means and created a limited space for women's liberty, but what were its consequences for the freedom struggles of Native Americans and of African-descended people? Why were Boston and Massachusetts, of all the places in British North America, the flashpoint for a movement that led to armed resistance, war, and the creation of a new nation? And above all, what do these stories of our nation's beginnings have to tell us about ourselves as a people today, continuing to grapple with the issues of justice, equality, civic virtue, how our voices can be heard in a time where such ideals and such questions are in short supply and feel so alive. So with all of that in mind, and I hope you will keep it in mind, I give you tonight's moderator, the Boston Globe's Ideas editor, Brian Bergstein. Brian.
Thank you, Nat. Thank you very much for that. Thank you all for being here, both those of you who are in person, those of you watching online, and thank you very much to our hosts at Revolutionary Spaces, the organization that stewards this great public hall. My colleagues and I in Globe Ideas and Globe Opinion are very pleased to be having this event here tonight, in this building that makes palpable just how much the American Revolution is very much also a Boston story. I will never get over the fact that there were 5,000 people in here on the night of the Boston Tea Party. So before we begin tonight's discussion, I just want to set the stage a little bit. As Nat mentioned, tonight's event builds on a special issue of Globe Ideas devoted to the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. It was called The Revolution Lives On, and if you haven't seen it, there are copies available. There's poster boards around the hall tonight, and hope you take it home and dive in as you'd like. But what do we mean when we say the revolution lives on? So there's two meanings to this, and we're going to hopefully get into both of these tonight, both in our panel discussion and then hopefully in the Q&A that will follow. The first part of the first meaning when we say the revolution lives on is simply that the story of the American Revolution, as familiar as it may seem, is still being told. It's not fully unearthed yet. It's not already entirely known and just something for dutiful reenactments by those people in tricorn hats and Minuteman costumes. What exactly happened in the revolution and why? These are stories that are still being discovered and reinterpreted. This is still the subject of fascinating scholarship, and we'll hear some of these surprising news stories tonight. Now, everything I mentioned about the revolution and why it's compelling, I mean, this would be true no matter what the state of our contemporary politics were. But as it happens, obviously, this subject is more fraught because the nature of the American project, the verdict on what kind of country we will be, feels up for grabs. Maybe you recall how Ben Franklin described the government that the founders had created. He said, "It's a republic if you can keep it." And so this is the second meaning of the idea that the American Revolution lives on. Certainly that was the animating spirit of the No Kings protests in recent weeks. But is the revolution as instructive for our current moment as we may like to think? There's some debate over that, and we'll get into that. This will also be part of what we cover tonight. So, I'm looking forward to getting into it, and let's do that. We have three panelists tonight who I'm very pleased to introduce. On my far left, I'd like to welcome Angela Tate, who is Chief Curator at the Museum of African American History, Boston and Nantucket, one museum across two locations. And the Boston Museum next week is opening up a very cool exhibition I urge you all to see. It's called Black Voices of the Revolution. Right here we have Costa Kennedy, closest to me, a wonderful journalist whose most recent book is The Ride, Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America. Costa did an amazing job capturing why this story that we think we know so well still has a lot of surprises and a remarkable amount of contemporary resonance. And then in the middle, Ted Widmer, a historian who was a consulting editor on the Revolution 250 package in Globe Ideas. I don't think it actually would have happened without him. And I can't do justice to Ted's background in a brief introduction, but just some of the highlights. He's written several books on American history. He teaches in the Honors College at the City University of New York. He was a speechwriter for Bill Clinton. He helped to create the George Washington Book Prize, which is awarded annually to a book about the founding era. So anyway, I'm really excited that all three of you are here to join us tonight. And Angela, I want to begin with you. In the exhibition that's about to open at the Museum of African American History on Beacon Hill, there's a striking line about how black people fought on both sides of the revolution, even though it was not their war. And I'm wondering if you'll share a little bit more about how this dynamic is slowly beginning, even now, beginning to be better understood. What don't we still fully understand about that?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for being here. One of the initial thoughts that I had about the exhibition was being a newcomer to Boston, being a newcomer to New England, and people asked me, what did you know before you moved here? And almost a year later, I realized I knew nothing. And so that is also the methodology that I used when helping to draft this exhibition with my boss, the president and CEO, Dr. Noel Trent, and our exhibition collaborator, Time Looper. So this is actually a digital exhibition as well as an analog exhibition. And so a lot of the questions that I'm still unearthing as we dawn upon day one of its opening is, what are these stories that are going to emerge every day when visitors engage with the exhibition? But the primary thing that I thought about was, what does it mean for this community in Boston and the community in Nantucket, because we are interpreting both sites, mean when you look at it through the lens of African Americans? One of the key points in this, I guess, debate about patriots versus loyalists is, why did particular black families, why did individuals choose to side with patriots versus loyalists? And in the interactive, you get to actually dive into that and make your own choices to uncover why they might have made either or decision. Because I think that even to this day, there's still a question of, well, why would you choose to go with the loyalists? We were fighting against the British. Why would you choose their side? Or why would you choose to fight on the patriot side, knowing that America still believed in the institution of slavery, even though it was abolished in Massachusetts by the end of the Revolutionary period? There was still this idea of, you will never be an equal member of society, so why would you choose to fight on that side? And so I I like to think of this as a space for everyone else to continue to think and to question, which, as Brian said, why is this still a moment that is so significant, or is it? And so when you're going through this experience, it is also asking that question.
So Kasha, this dynamic has to have been front of mind for you writing about Paul Revere. It's a story we think we know really well, and yet, as Angela's saying, there's still so much that we're still kind of trying to come to terms with. I mean, how did this play out in your research? What was something really surprising you found about this supposedly incredibly well-known story?
Well, there's a lot of smaller things, but one story that sort of stands out, and I think is part of your exhibition in a way, is on the night of Revere's ride, when he recounted it 23 years later. He describes encountering two British soldiers who were trying to capture him. And he says he met them right where Mark was hung in chains. And Mark was an enslaved man who in 1755, so 20 years before Revere's ride was in 1775, had been convicted of murdering his enslaver and had been hung and gibbeted, that means hung in chains, and put on display right on the road along Charlestown, going towards Charlestown. And this was really a rare thing. It was sort of a vestige of kind of punishment that would happen in England, and it still happened a little bit around Boston in that time, but it was primarily sort of like sea criminals, pirates, who would be hung in that way and gibbeted on the islands in Boston Harbor. It's very rare to have somebody in such a public view, where families would go to Meeting House, might pass on this road, or children and everything. And he described this as a landmark, a known landmark, and also 23 years later, he referred to it, and it was still a known place. And there's a lot to go into with that, but a couple of key points. This was, as I said, he was hung in 1755. He was still there on the night of April 18th in 75. Within a few months after the battle had begun, he was taken down. So there is a parallel to, there was some understanding among the people at the spearheading the revolution, meaning the Adamses, Joseph Warren, Hancock, that there was a deep inconsistency with trying to break from British control while at the same time having enslaved people in this town. And I should, just to put it in perspective, there wasn't enslavement here as there was in the South, right? So I think there were about 1% of the population in Massachusetts in 1775 was African American, and about maybe a quarter of them, it's hard to know, were enslaved. But it wasn't there were enslaved people at the market every day you encountered in real life. So it was an active part of life, and something that sort of the understanding of its injustice, I think, became clearer and clearer as the fight for freedom from British control was developing as well.
And so to be clear, this isn't just a sort of retroactive interpretation. Revere himself, in describing his ride, stopped to comment on the importance of this one landmark.
Yeah, and he would have known about it, because in 1775 it was Mark was hung, and a woman named Phyllis, also an enslaved woman who took part in this murder, was burned at the stake, right, in Charlestown. And people came, huge crowds came. There's no way to know or suspect that Revere himself was there, but he's a 20-year-old person living in Boston, and this was written about in the newspaper. So it was a hugely significant event, and it became a landmark because of it was conspicuous and so appalling. One thing I will say is that people you were gibbeted as sort of a warning. Don't do this, and this will happen to you. But I think over time, certainly today, but even in Revere's time, it became less of a story of what Mark had done wrong, but what had been done wrong to him. And in a way, it served that purpose of educating people. What had been done wrong to him and enslaved people in general.
So that story captures one of the ways that Boston and the colonies were changing throughout the Revolutionary period. Ted, what also comes to mind for you? You're such a great connoisseur of these kinds of stories. When you think about lesser known ways or underappreciated ways that the world was changing while the revolution was also changing the world, what do you think about?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Brian, for just being completely receptive to the idea of this series from the moment we began to talk about it, and editing it so well, including my own rather long pieces. They became much better after you edited them down. And I also want to say I'm just about having heart palpitations to be in this building. I came here, I was walking the Freedom Trail in the middle of the 1970s, around the time of the great bicentennial. I brought my mid-70s Red Sox cap, and I really think I wanted to become a historian from those 2 years, really. In 1975, some of you may remember, President Jerry Ford came to the Old North Church and went out to Concord and Lexington. And then 76, the big flotilla, and the Queen Elizabeth came to Boston. It was just thrilling. I see a lot of heads nodding. So it's really great to be back here. And as to the stories, I mean, they just never stopped. Once we had decided, once Brian gave the thumbs up to the series, I just went back into a lot of old books about the Revolution. Americans have been writing about the Revolution since it happened. I mean, it was the defining event of our history for a long time. Now I think it's a little bit receding from the public imagination. That was one reason it was so important to do this series, to kind of recover it. And I had a great time reading about the famous, and Kostya's piece about Paul Revere was fantastic, and the less well-known, and sometimes there are people kind of in between. You mentioned Joseph Warren a second ago, and I got really interested in him. He was maybe the most famous Bostonian in 1775. He was, a real leader. He's in fact the one, I believe, who ordered Revere and Dawes to go get on their horses and spread the alarm. He was a very prominent doctor in Boston. I thought that was interesting. He helped Bostonians get through a smallpox epidemic, and he was very charismatic, very well liked by everyone in Boston. And in the Battle of Bunker Hill, which we just went past the anniversary not many days ago, he volunteered to fight as a private and was killed. And it was an enormous loss for the American cause. He became the first great martyr of the Revolution. But I realized as we started our research, I knew very little about this guy. And so it was really interesting to recover Joseph Warren. And it's still happening. I'm still going through my stack of books, even though I'm not sure I need to anymore. But in the last day or two, just to respond to Angela's points, I came across someone I'd never heard of named Lemuel Haynes. Very interesting, mixed race African-American from near Springfield, Massachusetts, born into slavery, but a rather, relatively benign slavery where he was also educated and taught to read. And when the revolution breaks out, spring of 1775, he becomes a Minuteman with the town that he's from, comes to outside Boston and meets a lot of people and decides to become a minister and becomes the first known African-American minister of a New England church in Rutland, Vermont, and writes very powerfully about what the Declaration means to him. And he instantly understands something that a lot of people had trouble understanding, that these words in the Declaration about rights, all men are created equal, applied perfectly to African Americans. And he writes in an extremely persuasive way about it. So the revolution had some hypocrisy in it for sure, but it also really lifted up a lot of people, and there was no going back. Once we had started, and it started here in Boston, and really you could say in this building, there was no going back.
Yeah, I'm just a couple of things on Warren, who's a very interesting figure, and he was killed at Bunker Hill, as you said. Revere had lots of jobs. He's known as a silversmith, but he hustled to make money. One of his things was he was a self-trained dentist, Now, that's not the kind of dentist I want to go to, but, you know, some people may. And when Warren was killed at Bunker Hill, Revere was brought down to identify him by his teeth. The British really did not like Warren. He was too smart and too good at what he did. But one other thing about him, when he bought a home on Hanover Street, I think it's 1770, around then, there was an enslaved woman and her child in the house, and he bought the child. And there's sort of a purchase agreement, which was quite appalling to read, you know, where he sort of had a refund policy. If I don't think it's worth it, I'm gonna. And it was shocking and disturbing in a way, because he was he, as you mentioned, he as a doctor, he treated everyone, meaning loyalists, patriots, black people, white people, whatever. And it's possible that he then freed that slave, because when he was killed at Bunker Hill, there was no record of him having that. So he was right in the cusp of people who were, like, his parents are believed to have had enslaved people, and his children and descendants did not. So to me, he's a character who outlines sort of where we were in history. Not that everything was terrible before and everything immediately became great, but it was a little bit of a touch period. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Tommy. Yeah.
I mean, both of your comments do speak to the fact that the stories are untold because you need to read across the grain
Yes.
in the archive. I would also say that the unique part of working at both the Boston and the Nantucket sites is that the Nantucket house that is called the Boston Higginbotham House was built in 1774, 1775 by the Boston family, who gained their wealth through whaling later on in the 19th century. And then also the African Meeting House here in Boston was built in 1806. It was built by people who had lived through the Revolution. And one of the exciting parts about doing this work, also continuing to think about this time period, is the fact that descendants have started to reach out to the museum asking, do you have any documentation of my family? My family lived in this part of the neighborhood. My family might have attended the African Meeting House. And so when you're thinking about these untold stories, it's also people who are seeking their own family stories, who are then, if they kind of figure out this archival research, and I'm also doing a lot of the research as well, like, we're gonna be filling in these gaps that people don't think about, because these people did not leave traces in the archive that are traditionally known, that you can just go in and see, like 50 years worth of family letters, or they left some diaries, even though Dr. Trent was hoping that someone had written the diary and it was hidden and we discovered it, but that wasn't gonna happen. But so just thinking about, like, the work is ongoing because sources were read in the past that didn't take into account people who needed to be documented. And then the fact that when you are in Beacon Hill, the houses are from this area, and part of the Black Heritage Trail, which is owned by the museum because it was created by our founder, Sue Bailey Thurman, the last part, when you meet people through this little tiny passageway that takes you to the African Meeting House and the Abel Smith School. And I just thought about, like, whispering, gossip, people having illicit conversations that are always that are never going to be documented, but the actual physical space, you can imagine what people might have been passing, what news they might have been sharing, what gossip they might have heard from their employers or enslavers, and just were in that passageway. And then later on, they built that church, which became a community space for abolition, anti-slavery, as well as continuing to grapple with this revolutionary period and the ideals that America says they hold dear, but slavery counteracts that.
Let's move, if we can, a little bit into this other half of the meaning of the revolution living on, which is, like, what do we do? There's so much interesting work that is still being done to tell us more about what happened, but to make sense of it now. Kostya, you point out in your book, and as you wrote in a subsequent ideas piece, both the American right and the left claim Paul Revere as a sort of, like, ideological ancestor. Is there anyone else like that in American history who kind of speaks to people across the political spectrum?
I mean, I think that, his ride and the metaphor of his ride and the actual act of his ride is an easy thing to apprehend. And if I say somebody is a Paul Revere of something, you kind of know what I mean. So you get a Tea Party group in Michigan has a citizen outreach program called Operation Paul Revere, and then you get Greta Thunberg holding up 2 lanterns, sounding the alarm for climate change. You get, when there was talk of, I'm going to actually say this out loud, of annexing Canada as a state, somebody had that idea. There was a journalist in Canada saying, you know, the Americans are coming, the Americans are coming. And then there's a journalist, and maybe you guys know Douglas Murray, the kind of neoconservative journalist who the Wall Street Journal called the Paul Revere the Paul Revere of Europe. There's also, by the way, a pizza chain in Iowa called Paul Revere Pizza for its speed and reliability in delivery. So he's taken by a lot of people. And the other thing I want to say is not, you're right that this time is a particularly fraught time, of course, but people were invoking the idea of Paul Revere. The suffragist movement did. They were drawing. They would say, you know, a faux Paul Revere holding up the sign for women's votes. In World War II, his imagery was on sort of, you know, rally the troops kind of material. And in Vietnam, there was the protest group that wanted to march his route in reverse, sort of the undoing of democracy. So while it is important, it basically had resonance all the way through, I'm sure sometimes more than others, but it's so, I'm talking with you in particular, but I think this whole enterprise is so ingrained and such a part of our collective story that it's been part of our discussion ever since, basically.
But I mean, you know, Ted, you wrote in Ideas, you pointed out that the Gadsden flag, Don't Tread on Me, from 1775, that is a popular bit of iconography on the right. It showed up at January 6th. I think you said that there's this kind of more like explicit call on the right for a second American Revolution, right? So how do we make sense of, what do we do? Is the revolution just like a basket of memes that anybody can grab, or is there actually really something meaningfully, you know, for us as a political project now?
That was the goal of our series, I would say, to lift up the discussion, because it has become sort of memes and angry bursts on social media on both sides. You mentioned No Kings a couple weeks ago, and you also just mentioned the Heritage Foundation talked about the Second American Revolution just before Donald Trump became president. Project 25, the document they drafted, is their blueprint for what the Second American Revolution will look like. So both sides draw heavily on the, well, I guess I would say the memes and the imagery, not so much the knowledge of what the American Revolution was. So we were trying to point that out and say, isn't it interesting that the MAGA folks love the American Revolution? And on January 6, 2021, they were all texting each other, today is 1776. And that fit a worldview in which there is a deep state or a swamp that needs to be drained, and patriots are being called from the real America to drain the swamp. I mean, I think that was a mistaken view, but I understand why they felt that way. But on the left, also, there's a very vivid feeling that there's an out-of-control executive, not unlike King George III was in the years leading up to the Revolution. And many of Thomas Jefferson's accusations, you know, the Declaration of Independence, there's the beautiful language, and then there's kind of a long, boring section where he lists everything King George has done wrong. And a lot of that is about ignoring the rules of justice, of jailing people and sending them to other countries where no one can hear from them again, or not showing warrants, or messing with trade and tariffs. I mean, it's pretty interesting to read now. So both sides care about the revolution, but they haven't learned enough about it to really talk to each other.
But so are we just doomed to talk past each other through July 4th, 2026 and beyond? Or is there something that is something really to grab onto here. I don't know that you have to answer that as much as, speculate whether it's...
It's a teaching
there's a
moment,
way
as
out.
Barack Obama liked to say, and a teachable moment. And my earnest prayer is that the two sides calm down and listen to each other a little more. I'm pretty pessimistic that'll happen, but it would be great if we just said we are actually one country and let's learn from each other.
Yeah, and I just want to say that history and even the present divides things, so you're here or you're there, and actually, Angela began saying, well, why would you fight for the loyalists if they were trying to take control? Why would you fight for the patriots if you knew there was enslavement in America? These are all individual people making individual decisions that might depend on the circumstance of their own life and their background. And there wasn't necessarily, obviously there was a codified view, and there was first the Suffolk Resolves and then and other documents, and then the Declaration of Independence, of course, everybody gets on board. But along the way, there's a lot of disparity in thought, and I think that's still true. In the years leading up to the revolution, in 1774, in the fall of 1774, there was a Massachusetts artillery company, which the kind of closest thing to an army training ground. There was no Continental Army at that point. And loyalists and patriots would train side by side, just as they would go to meeting house together, and they would go to taverns together. They disagreed, but they weren't mortal enemies until they were, in the real sense. So I think that there is, you spoke about the hope for common ground, and I don't know that I'm any more optimistic, but it's possible. It's possible. Let's think that.
I don't know. I think there's a little bit of a gray area when it comes to my thoughts about the revolutionary period and July 4th, 2026. So Dr. Trent declared Juneteenth to July 4th to be kind of like this moment of thinking about freedom. And freedom is, it can be a fixed word, but it can also be contingent. And I also like to think about, when your comments about how people have been using this period for their own political sides, I'm also just like, different points in American history have had different thoughts. So one of the pieces that we have in the exhibition is William Coopernell's Colored Patriots of the Revolution, which he wrote in the thick of the abolitionist movement in the 1840s to say black people were a part of the making of this country, hence why slavery should be abolished. One of the other research topics that I was interested in when I started grad school at Northwestern was what is American culture through World's Fair. So there was, the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, which is, as I've learned through the Massachusetts 250 discussions, Philadelphia claims to be where the revolutionary period begins. I also grew up in Northern Virginia until I moved here. I was like, oh, this is the other state that says this is where America began. Okay. And so just thinking about different points in time commemorating the 1776 period, when there was a semi-quintennial in 1926, there was another fair that was a flop. No one cared in the 1920s. And this is also a time period when nativism and the KKK reemerged to declare who was and was not American. So why did they not care about the American Revolution in that time period? And then, of course, I wasn't alive yet, but my mother and my grandparents still kept their memorabilia. And you have your wonderful hat from 1976. And that's also a moment when public history, my particular academic field, and historic preservation reemerged as careers, and people actually caring about, oh, let's save places like this. Let's save like heritage tours and historic parks. And so at this 1976 period, they're like, oh, we need to save our actual buildings and our sites that they didn't care about decades before or 100 years before. So in 2025, going into 2026, our feelings and thoughts about the revolutionary period are also a part of our everyday lives in this particular context that wouldn't be the same context as 1976, 1926, or 1876. So it's a little bit more of a gray area.
I mean, one thing I'm learning, I think, from each of you is how much the revolution was shaped by individual action, these kind of contingent decisions, these things that were, people decided what to do and how to do it based on their own, what was right for their family, what was best for their economic prospects. Ideology may have been less important than we like to imagine, and I wonder if that's somehow guidance for us now to sort of separate the sort of, what we're supposed to do with what we actually can do in our own lives.
I agree. Less ideology would be helpful. And since you asked the question about how do we think it'll be next year, I started to remember Boston in the mid-'70s. I'm thinking about it again, and it was a really rough time in this city in 1974 and 5. It was the time of busing and an economic slump and just a lot of anger. It wasn't so much a national crisis, but it was a local crisis. And despite that, Boston had a fantastic bicentennial. And so just because we're feeling how divided we are in 2025 doesn't mean we can't hope for something a little better next year.
I think we're all hoping, and I want to also just pick up on something that Angela said about over time, and I'm going to go back to Revere here, but the reason why everybody in this room has probably at least heard of Paul Revere is because of the poem by Henry Longfellow. And that poem, as many of you may know, it was obviously 75 was Revere's ride. And that poem was written in 1860 and first published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1861. And Longfellow went to the Old North Church, and well, he knew the area very well and had grown up nearby, was living nearby. And he wrote that poem as sort of a not so veiled urge for abolitionists. We were on the eve of the Civil War to take action. And he wasn't a political person in general, but he was firmly against enslavement. And so even then, so it's now 85 years later, right? So a long time ago from now, but then it was history at that point, clearly. Hardly a man was still alive. And he used the actions of the Civil War to tell a story and try to relate to the pressing issue of the day, which, we could do in a more nuanced way now, but we aren't quite.
I just want to remind everybody that we'll have questions. If anybody has some, starting in a little bit, there'll be microphones moving around. So think about something that you might want to ask our panel. And also those online watching on the live stream, feel free to send in questions that we can select for this group up here. Speaking of questions, Angela, I noticed that you're fond of a quote that for a curator such as yourself, it's not your job to produce answers, it's your job to produce good questions. And I'm just curious if that brings to mind, what are some good questions we should all be asking ourselves about the American Revolution?
You pulled that quote, which I didn't expect, but I'm glad because that is, like I said, moving here in September, having never thought anything about New England beyond it's cold and baked beans in Boston and Parker rolls. That's the only thing I kind of knew in terms of like culture and, and so people who are from here, who are familiar, who are, history buffs, I hope that they enter the space and go, oh, I thought I knew about that, but I didn't. And then also for people like me who are just now experiencing this, thinking like, well, why do we remember this period in a particular? Why is it that, we're in K through 12, there are these key moments and then they move on and that's the only thing we're taught is important about this time period. And then also, as we discussed when you came by to see the exhibition in progress, that the revolutionary period doesn't quite neatly map onto Black history. A lot of the narrative in the exhibition begins in the 1600s. So we talk about Zipporah Potter Atkins, because if you've never been to the Boston campus, when you walk into the Abel Smith School, we have a list of names on the beams of particular African Americans that we consider to be significant to the neighborhood and to Boston. And until I was asked to speak about Zipporah Potter Atkins on TV earlier this spring, it was still snowing, so there's snow in my hair. And everybody was like, you live in Boston, why didn't you wear a hat? And I was like, I didn't know. And so she bought a house. So there's a marker on the Rose Kennedy Greenway near the North End where her house may have stood, which she purchased with money she inherited from her father. And there's also a public artwork that contends with what her home might have looked like. And so if this is a moment of thinking about someone appearing in the historical record, and she's a homeowner, and then later on, Black people are appearing in the historical records in various ways that you might not think of as historical sources, like, as I recently learned, confession narratives, which were very popular in colonial New England. And then you start to think about, well, if Black people were appearing in the historical narrative in these particular ways, what does that mean for us, creating this periodization of 1776 to 1783, when, of course, the condition and the institution and the culture of slavery was this driving force for, as Custia mentioned, of Paul Revere and then the Patriots saying, oh, we're being oppressed by the British. And so this language of slavery is a part of the American Revolution from our founding fathers, but then it's also a part of the culture of this growing society that still continues into the 19th century and still is contended with of what does it mean for so much of this, of the document, so much of the spirit, so much of the culture around the founding of this nation is about freedom and liberty, but yet slavery was such an entrenched institution in this country.
So it's really interesting. We tend to think a lot about the American Revolution as having kicked off so much, obviously. But what's interesting, too, is how much was already going on in the rest of the world that helped to pave the way, not only, say, like conflict between Britain and France, which, you know, made it possible for us to militarily defeat the British, but just even the fact that there had been a revolution in Haiti just before. And so, Ted, you've actually written for Ideas about this context for the American Revolution being a little bit larger than we typically remember.
Right.
How do you think about that?
Well, one of the many amazing things about the American Revolution is the people who started it were also still around when it ended, which is actually pretty unusual for a revolution. You mentioned Haiti. That turns extremely bloody. The French Revolution started idealistic, somewhat inspired by our own, turned very bloody. The Russian Revolution, there are some mild revolutionaries who are kicked out and mostly killed, and then Lenin takes over and it becomes very bloody. So you hear the word revolution and it's a pretty dramatic word. It usually means violence. And I mean, there was violence in the war of the American Revolution. And there were civilians who lost their lives too, but still it was the same people who were largely Enlightenment thinkers inspired by a century of writing about the limits of political power and how kings really were not divinely appointed. And so the Americans were inspired by that. And as they're fighting a very difficult war, which we would not have won without the French, as you mentioned, they're also thinking about a constitutional order and how will these 13 very different colonies and then their states, how will they become a single country and 3 branches of government and checks? I mean, it's really hard stuff. And it's a second miracle. The first miracle maybe is that they won the war. And the second miracle is that they devised a working system of government that we still live under with plenty of problems, but it still endures.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that and absolutely defer to you, Ted, about the particulars here, but it seemed to me with an evolving thought situation, so that in September of 1774, I don't think they knew exactly what things were going to look like when they got to start doing the Declaration of Independence and then the Bill of Rights and all that. So that even at the Suffolk Resolve, which I mentioned before, which was sort of as close to a declaration of war that you could sort of make without making it, and that was a document brought and adopted at the First Continental Congress in the fall of '74. The language in it still sort of accepted George as a sovereign. It's just that we don't like what you're doing. We don't like the taxes. We don't like the coercive acts of appointing judges in our court system. We don't like people quartering in our houses. We don't like it. And it's almost like, I bet you don't like it either. They're just getting a little out of your control. So if you just shape up, we'll be good, kind of. There wasn't, they still, and to the end, this is why there was still a debate over the who fired the first shot. There was a hope to avoid war. Like, it's not, and maybe that's why, I hadn't thought about it, maybe that's why it wasn't as bloody as it might have been. There wasn't this deep enmity for everybody who raised their hand as a loyalist, or everybody who raised their hand saying, I want to try a different system. It would just reach this impasse that forced it to a head.
Before we move to questions from the audience, I just was thinking this idea that the people who started it were there at the finish, but we know Paul Revere from the very start. What does he go on to do during the Revolution?
So he finally moved out of the north end of Boston where he lived. He had sort of a little bit of an ill-fated turn in the Massachusetts militia. There was an expedition that didn't go so well in Penobscot, but he stayed very involved. Just one quick thing on Revere. He's somebody we've mentioned, Warren tonight, and the Adamses, and John Hancock, who's probably the wealthiest man in the colonies then. These were all people who went to Boston Latin or Roxbury Latin. They went to Harvard. Revere's dad came over on a boat from France. He certainly didn't go to a private school. He certainly didn't go to college. He was a smart guy, certainly literate, but he worked. He was a blue-collar worker. And so he went on, and he became a bell maker. There are still bells throughout New England and the country that are still being rung, made by him. And very significantly, he learned to roll copper. Revere copper became a very important concern, and people still remember having Revere copper. And that copper sheathed the hulls of our boats in the War of 1812. And people have said to me who are very close to Revere, you could say that the biggest impact he had actually on American military success was rolling and providing that copper for the War of 1812. He lived to be 83. He was 40 at the time of his ride, but he went and had a very long and contributing life to America.
If there are any questions in the audience, I think people will come around with microphones. There was a question, first hand went up right here. Thanks, Therese.
Hi, my name is Jan Dumas. I actually live in the city of Revere. I can't escape the man. I've always wondered, why is there so much written about Paul Revere, who actually didn't successfully complete his ride, and so little written about Dawes, who did?
So it's a good question, and the reason why Revere is more famous has to do with the poem. Revere did complete the ride to Lexington, and that was the initial goal, was to go to Lexington, where Hancock and Samuel Adams were now living in Lexington. It had gotten much too hot in Boston. There were people vandalizing Hancock's home, and either one of those men could have been arrested. They moved out to Lexington, where the Provincial Congress was. So they were successful in getting there. Then they continued from there to, Dawes also made it. Miraculously, Dawes didn't alert anybody on his way. We're not sure why, but Revere seemed to have been much more successful in that. Then they continued on their way to Concord, and as you're pointing out, he did not make it to Concord. Neither did Dawes. Dawes was also stopped. There was a third rider who got on. But the last thing I want to say about Revere is that after he lost his horse, he kind of talked it, well, he was first captured, kind of talked his way out of being held by the British, lost his horse, and then on foot went back to Lexington, right back into the thick of it, again to go to where Adams and Hancock were, and that's why he was on the ground when the first shot was fired. So he was certainly not a solitary hero. There was a network of dozens of riders that night, but he was the principal guy, and he was the progenitor for much of that extra activity.
Does Paul Revere Pizza use horses to deliver their pizzas?
No, but they should. You should be their marketing director.
Great idea.
I think I saw another hand right here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
This may be a bit off topic, but some of you mentioned the fact that at the same time in history, there was a revolution in Haiti, there's something else happening. I'm just curious to know that, has this been researched? Has anyone written about it? Somebody else mentioned 1857. I'm not sure what the significance was. But in India, that was the first Indian War of Independence, 1857, although the British called it the Sepoy Mutiny. So I'm just curious, has there been research at that moment of time, what was happening around the world, how it influenced everything?
I think the answer is yes. There's been a rise in the last generation on global history. So it's important to think of the United States as part of something that is now called the Atlantic world, that includes the Caribbean and South America. And the history of slavery, when you pull the camera back, huge numbers of Africans were going into the Caribbean and to South America. So it just deepens our knowledge to know that. I can't think of a specific book that looks at India and the American Revolution or the United States at the same time, but I remember something from a long time ago. Cornwallis, the English general who loses to George Washington at Yorktown, which is the final battle, he then is transferred to India, where I think he lost a few more battles for the British, and I believe he's buried in India. So.
Quick lightning round question before we take some more. What would have happened had the colonists not won the revolution?
Had they not won the revolution at all?
That's right. Had we lost?
Well, we would be sipping tea and having strawberries and cream right about now, I think, right? What do you think? No, that's a great question there. I mean, it's almost too large of a question. There's no, to me, and again, there's no way they would have continued to govern remotely from England indefinitely. Certainly, I would say if those initial battles of Lexington and Concord had not been as successful as they were, there wouldn't have been the success, even in defeat at Bunker Hill, that they had. And we would not be, July 4th, 1776 would not have been our day. It would have been years. It would have taken a lot more time to get there.
Didn't Alex Beam write a funny piece?
He did.
Yeah.
That's in the package, yeah. We have another hand up over here. Right here in the second row, Therese.
First of all, thank you so very much for this entire presentation. It's just been fascinating. Although I'm a Boston native, I have lived for the last 40 years in Central Virginia, exactly halfway in between Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, which is all about the Declaration of Independence and about slavery, and James Madison's Montpelier, which is all about the Constitution and increasingly about slavery. So on the one hand, we have the No Kings, right? And then if I go north, there's the balance of powers. So I'm curious about whether the current press for a very powerful executive has any roots at all in the American Revolution and the thought processes of the time. And particularly, is there anything in the Boston stories that supports a movement for a stronger executive than we ended up with for the last 250 years?
Wonderful question. My reading of, well, certainly the beginning of the revolution is that a fear of the executive was the dominant feeling. They did not like King George III, although a lot of that happened in the year 1776. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is printed at the beginning of 1776, and that's the first direct attack on the king as the cause of everything. Before that, Bostonians were more mad at Parliament than the king. One interesting thing in Jefferson's Declaration is it's all about the king. The word Parliament is not used in the Declaration of Independence. But then they get through the victory, Yorktown, and they set up the Articles of Confederation, and it's just so weak. Any state can veto any major act. The state I'm from, Rhode Island, was ruining it for everyone else because anytime there was a new tax, Rhode Island would say no thanks, and it wouldn't go through, so there was no money. There were also difficult situations in the western parts of states, including this state. Shays' Rebellion in 1786. And so they just needed some order. And they looked at George Washington and they thought this guy would make a great president. So the Constitution creates a pretty strong executive, and arguably it has become too strong in recent years. It's a book by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., The Imperial Presidency. Every generation has given more power to the president, and now we see a president who doesn't really consult Congress on any matter whatsoever, including bombing Iran. Congress is supposed to have the war power, and it's supposed to have the power of the purse. It's very unclear what's going to happen in the days ahead with this bill pending. So.
This actually fits with a question that we got from a viewer online. Any one of you, feel free to take it. How, quote unquote, mad was King George III? Is that really a kind of a true story? And did his sort of personal madness contribute either to triggering the revolution or to its ultimate success? What do we know about that?
Well, I think he was certainly angry in that sense of mad. I don't really know exactly the state of his decline right at that time. It wasn't like, sort of James Otis, who was a very important progenitor of the revolution in the 1760s, had sort of gone mad by the time we got to the rubber hitting the road. It was still like decisions being made here. Thomas Gage made a lot of mistakes, certainly, at the outset of the revolution. You mentioned Cornwallis, who didn't fare too well, where I think things went wrong. But I don't really know exactly how much his madness actually impacted the day. But maybe one of you can elaborate on that.
All I'm going to say is I watched the film when I was in high school, and it was very entertaining. But on a more serious note, Ted, your mentioning of the U.S. presidents gaining more and more power, it just made me think of connecting to that question of, the 1688 Glorious Revolution in England, which is why we had the Hanover Kings, because they were like, Parliament is going to be in charge. No more kings controlling the country. And so Thomas Jefferson talking to the king, but then up here in Boston, they're talking to Parliament, and it's two different relationships with England.
Any other questions from the audience? And by the way, we're going to have a reception after, which I hope everybody will join us for. It's going to start in just a few minutes. So after this, please do feel free to stay and hang out and join us. How about right here in the front row?
I have a couple of questions, this latter of which might be a little bit harder to answer. First, I was just wondering if someone could give me a couple of the main differences between the English Civil War and the American Revolutionary War. And secondly, I'm wondering how, obviously he died before the end of the war, but how would Locke have responded to the conclusion of it? John Locke.
Anyone?
I can give you some fuzzy memories from grad school. And I think the English Civil War was a little more of an influence on Bostonians than other Americans. Because here in New England, there were certain local traditions that kept the memory of the early New England ancestors vivid. There was an annual speech given, I believe, on Boston Common called the New England Election Day Sermon. And over again, those guys hit the same theme that the English kings of 100 years ago were terrible. Our ancestors who fled were wonderful. And we should be on guard against any usurpations of our local government. So I think only in New England they remembered the English Civil War quite well. It was an internal struggle. There was a king, Charles I, who put a lot of people in jail and had an archbishop who also was clamping down on religious dissent. That's what drove a lot of New Englanders here, and they just fled. But in England, a lot of people began to push back. Oliver Cromwell, a good general, and a parliament that was willing to stand up to a king, and they executed him. He was guillotined in 1649, and then there was like an 11-year period where Cromwell was in charge. Then they brought the kings back. So the kings came back, but some of the aura of the throne was tarnished, because if kings could be eliminated, that set a precedent for other peoples around the world.
One thing I just want to add, and I can't answer that specific question, is that you mentioned like sort of fleeing for why they came here, right? Why the pilgrims came here, and so that's 1630 or so, right? 1620, and at the time leading up to the Revolutionary War, a lot of the missives that were sent, again by the folks around here, the Brace of Adamses and the others, to London, would invoke that time and say, just as you persecuted our forefathers, we're not going to stand for it now, right? And again, so at that point, that's 140 years ago. It was already a long time ago, but the stain of the English system that forced this place into existence, in a way, was still very much a part of the thinking and the inherited thought that the people leading the revolution had.
If we can table the John Locke portion for the reception after, we can get in one more question, if that's okay. How about back there? We haven't really gone back that direction.
Hello. So I think I'm going to maybe go for an interesting angle of the revolution. I think there's one figure that I've always been really fascinated by, and that's like Thomas Paine, who I think not only was very influential in terms of anti-monarchy within the U.S., but also seemed to articulate kind of somewhat old-fashioned version of a kind of modern left-wing politics. I mean, I wonder if you'd have any commentary on his relation to the modern left-wing as it exists today.
Well, I would actually urge you to Google Thomas Paine, Boston Globe Ideas, because we had a piece written by one of our contributors last year or the year before on why he's the best founding father, deeply underrated, and it might actually get into some of what you're talking about. But I don't know if any of the real experts up here have any thoughts on Paine.
More than most of the founders, he wrote in snappy prose. He might have done well on social media. And Jefferson's a great writer, but it's long sentences and paragraphs. And Paine cut right to the, he's not American, he's English, but he is a really important founder all the same. No one was more against the King of England than this English guy who showed up and urged us to peel away all the veneer and see George III as a tyrant, and it worked.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time for the formal portion. I hope you will stick around for the reception. I want to thank the panelists, Angela, Ted, and Kostya. You were wonderful. Thank you. And again, thank all of you for being here. Thank you so much. Thank you to our hosts from Revolutionary Spaces. And have a good night.
Thank you.